I remember the exact moment the sun started to set, and my heart began to sink. The parking lot was nearly empty, the highway just beyond buzzing with cars that weren't mine, heading to destinations I wasn't a part of. My phone had just died. The last message I saw was a laughing emoji. That was it. That was the punchline to the cruelest joke my family had ever played on me. They thought it would be funny to leave me stranded in another state, hours away from home, with no money, no help, no plan. This wasn't some teenage prank or an innocent miscommunication. This was intentional, orchestrated, filmed even for their amusement, and I was the unwilling star of the show. I stood there for hours, waiting for a car that never turned around, hoping that the faces I trusted most in the world would come back and say, "Gotcha," but they didn't, and with each minute that passed, I stopped hoping. Instead, I started remembering the dozens of times they'd laughed at my expense, the moments I brushed off as just their humor. This wasn't humor, this was humiliation wrapped in a smile. You don't understand the gravity of being left behind until it happens to you, by the very people who are supposed to protect you. There was no apology, no explanation. Just the silence that followed when I finally made it back, on a bus alone, surrounded by strangers who treated me with more kindness than my own flesh and blood. They welcomed me with blank stares and mumbled excuses, as if I should have known better than to take it personally. "It was just a joke," they said. "Lighten up," they said. But betrayal doesn't feel lighter when it comes from your own family. It feels like a stone tied to your spirit, dragging you down into cold, bitter realization. It wasn't just about being left in another state. It was the metaphor that broke me, being emotionally abandoned in my own life. For years, I'd lived in the shadows of their sarcasm, the punchline in family dinners, the target of every "just kidding." And now the truth was impossible to ignore. This wasn't about laughter, this was about power. They left me because they could, because they thought I'd forgive them like always, because I was the sensitive one, and they were just having fun. But that day changed something fundamental inside me. Alone, stranded in unfamiliar streets, I learned the value of silence. I learned how to navigate with instinct instead of instruction. I learned that survival isn't just physical, it's emotional, it's mental. Every stranger that offered directions, every step I took with blistered feet, was a stitch in a new version of myself, one that didn't need their approval or their cruel validation. I became someone who could stand alone, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. And when I came back, something else had changed. I stopped laughing at their jokes. I stopped apologizing for my boundaries. I stopped pretending I was okay with being hurt, so long as it was dressed in humor. And they noticed. The room felt colder. They said I'd changed. I had. Because once you've been left behind like a forgotten bag on a highway, you realize you were never really part of the journey to begin with. You were just cargo, convenient, expendable, unimportant. But here's the irony. Being stranded was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to face a reality I'd been avoiding. It exposed the fragile illusion of unconditional love in a home where affection was measured by how well you took a joke. And it gave me the strength to rebuild myself with truth instead of tolerance. I stopped chasing their approval. I started choosing peace over proximity, and that distance, it became my safety. It became my strength. I never needed them to carry me. I just needed them not to drop me for a laugh. And when they did, I rose anyway, alone, yes, but never again broken by the sound of their laughter, because now the only voice that matters is mine, and it no longer whispers, it speaks, it demands, it survives. And survival, I've come to learn, is the best kind of revenge. Betrayal disguised as a joke is one of the most insidious forms of emotional manipulation, because it wraps cruelty in the costume of laughter, and then dares you to object without being labeled too sensitive, or overdramatic. It is the quiet kind of betrayal, the kind that hides in plain sight, the kind that tells you, "You're being ridiculous, we were only playing," while your trust bleeds quietly behind the curtain. That's how it started with my family. Everything was always a joke. Every insult had a laugh track. Every dismissive comment came with a smirk and a nudge. They trained me to laugh at myself before I ever learned how to stand up for myself. At first it was small, the kind of jokes people pass off at dinner tables, teasing about my weight, my dreams, the way I dressed, the way I spoke. I'd get up the courage to say, "That hurts," and be met with an eye roll or worse, a sarcastic, "Oh no, are we crying again?" They turned emotional bruises into inside jokes. They weaponized humor as a shield, and because I loved them, because I wanted to be accepted, I laughed along. That laugh, hollow and brittle, became a survival mechanism. It was easier to pretend nothing hurt than to risk being laughed at even more for saying it did. But that moment when they left me stranded in another state hours from home, in a place I didn't know, with no money, no backup plan, and no way to reach out, it was the crescendo of a joke that had gone too far. It wasn't just about the physical distance. It was about the psychological distance they had always maintained, one where I was the outsider in my own family, the easy target, the one always taking things too seriously. This time, the punchline left me with blistered feet and a soul too heavy to carry. They told me afterward that it was all planned, that they thought it would be hilarious to drive off without telling me, that they were filming my reaction, waiting to see if I'd panic or laugh or cry. And they laughed as they told the story, laughed as if the sight of their sibling, cousin, or child standing alone in a parking lot, surrounded by nothing but silence, was the kind of humor you bottle and share at reunions. They laughed like it wasn't betrayal. But it was a betrayal not just of my physical safety, but of every ounce of emotional trust I had left in them. What made it worse, what made it sting in a way I still can't quite describe, is that they expected me to be in on the joke after the fact. They expected me to forgive instantly, to see the humor in my own humiliation, to be the good sport I always was. But this time I couldn't, because this time the damage was too raw. There was no laugh track in my head, only the sound of my voice asking myself why they thought it was okay to treat me like that. Why was I always the one it was safe to hurt? Why was I the family's emotional punching bag disguised as comic relief? The betrayal was not a single moment. It was layered. It was in the planning, the execution, the glee in their voices when they recounted it. It was in the absence of remorse, the absence of empathy. They had turned my fear, my isolation, into entertainment. I wasn't a person to them in that moment. I was content, something they could record and laugh about. It shook me because I had to accept that perhaps they never saw me as equal, not emotionally, not relationally. I had always been the one they could afford to lose for a few hours, the one whose feelings were optional, the one who didn't matter enough to protect. This kind of betrayal digs deeper than most because it makes you question your own perception. Was it really that bad? Am I overreacting? Should I just laugh too? That's what betrayal disguised as a joke does. It makes the victim feel like the villain for simply being hurt. It shifts the narrative so skillfully that by the time you start to feel pain, everyone around you is already laughing, and you're left with a decision. Join the laughter and betray yourself, or speak your truth and become the outsider again. And the truth is, I'd rather be alone than laugh at a joke that cost me my dignity. Emotional and psychological abandonment doesn't always come in loud arguments or clear, hurtful words. Sometimes it arrives in moments of silence, when you look around for comfort and realize no one is there. When I was left stranded, the physical distance was shocking, yes, but it was the emotional distance, the emptiness of knowing that no one was coming back, That truly broke something inside me. It was the moment I realized I wasn't seen as someone to be worried about, to be looked after, or even thought of with basic decency. They had driven off not because they had forgotten me, but because they knew I was there and chose to leave me anyway. That was abandonment in its cruelest form, deliberate, conscious, and laced with laughter. It's hard to explain how alone a person can feel while surrounded by people they're supposed to belong to. I had sat at the same tables, shared meals, smiled in photos. But those were all just rehearsals for a family role. I never actually landed. Being left behind like that exposed what I had tried for years not to see. I was never emotionally held, never deeply valued beyond convenience or obligation. It's one thing to be forgotten, it's another to be dismissed while fully visible. My presence wasn't an accident. They knew I was there, and it didn't matter. That kind of abandonment doesn't scream, it whispers constantly, like a voice in the back of your mind, telling you you're not worth the space you take up. I remember standing there, watching the taillights disappear, thinking, they wouldn't do this if they loved me the way I love them. And yet, I had no proof to argue with that thought. Every moment they were gone, every minute that passed without a phone call, a U-turn, or a message saying we're just kidding, we're coming back, was evidence that I didn't matter enough. You start to question your value, not just in that moment, but in every memory you've ever shared with them. Were you ever really included, or were you just tolerated? There's a unique kind of grief that comes with emotional abandonment. It's not dramatic or cinematic. It's quiet and chronic. It lingers in your chest, not as a wound, but as a vacancy. And in that silence, all you hear is the echo of your own worthlessness. Worthlessness that was handed to you not by strangers, but by people who once kissed your forehead and said, "We'll always be here." It was that promise, broken in such a calculated and public way, that became unbearable, because it wasn't just about being left behind physically. It was about being emotionally erased. My needs and safety deemed less important than a cheap laugh. Later, when I returned and confronted them, they acted confused by my reaction. "You're overthinking it," they said. "It wasn't a big deal." That's the most sinister part of emotional abandonment, when the abandoners pretend it never happened, or worse, that you imagined it. That gaslighting only deepens the psychological impact. It makes you doubt not just them but yourself. You ask, am I too fragile? Am I being dramatic? But no matter how many times I replayed the moment, the truth didn't change. They left me on purpose, and they felt nothing about it except amusement. What they didn't realize was that the moment they left, they also forced me to stop depending on them emotionally. They killed the illusion that they would be there when it truly mattered, and once that belief dies, it can't be resurrected. I could no longer pretend we were close or that our relationship was safe. Emotional safety is the foundation of love, and once you know that someone can watch you suffer and still laugh, that foundation crumbles. You begin to wall yourself off, not out of bitterness, but necessity. You stop sharing the intimate parts of yourself, the dreams, the fears, the soft pieces, because you now know they can and will be used against you. And the worst part, you mourn them while they're still alive. You grieve what you thought you had, what you wished you had. You walk away, not because you want to, but because staying would mean continuing to bleed in silence. Emotional abandonment turns family into strangers. It forces you to become your own anchor. And while self-reliance is powerful, the road to it is lonely, paved with the realization that sometimes the people who raised you were never really there for you to begin with. Forced self-reliance is never a choice. It's a reaction, a survival instinct that kicks in when no one shows up for you. When I was left stranded in another state, I had no plan, no preparation, no backup. There was no slow transition into independence, no mentoring, no safety net. It was a brutal shove into the unknown, one that demanded I figure things out in real time, under pressure, with no margin for error. In that moment, I wasn't just left alone. I was made to depend on myself in the most raw, immediate way. And the most painful truth was that it didn't have to happen this way. I didn't choose this. They chose it for me, and then they called it a joke. When you're forced to rely solely on yourself, every decision becomes heavier. There's no one to call, no one to double-check with, no one to assure you that you're doing the right thing. I remember standing outside the gas station, phone dead in my pocket, trying to calculate how far the nearest bus stop was. I didn't know the area. I didn't have GPS. I didn't even have enough money to buy a ticket outright. I had to talk to strangers, ask questions, humble myself in a way that felt vulnerable and frightening. It wasn't just about finding a way home. It was about confronting the fact that I was entirely alone, and any mistake I made could lead to real consequences. It wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was survival. That night taught me more about myself than any lecture, any upbringing, any family wisdom ever could. Because once you're thrown into the deep end without warning, you stop looking around for help and start becoming your own solution. I had to learn to trust my instincts. I had to learn to manage fear, not suppress it, but acknowledge it, carry it, and still move forward. I walked miles that day, not just physically, but emotionally. With every step, I was shedding the belief that someone would eventually come back for me. They didn't, so I walked. The emotional shift that comes from forced self-reliance is profound. You stop assuming that anyone is going to catch you when you fall. You start preparing for every situation as if you're the only one responsible. At first it's exhausting. You second-guess everything. You replay conversations in your head, wondering what you missed, what you did wrong to end up here. But eventually, that second-guessing gives way to something else: clarity. You stop trying to prove your pain to others and start validating it yourself. You learn how to move without needing permission. You learn how to act without applause. By the time I made it home, something in me had hardened, but not in a bitter way. It was more like a scar forming over a wound. I had done something no one thought I could do. Not even myself. I had navigated unfamiliar territory, emotionally and literally, and survived it. And in doing so, I discovered a version of myself that didn't rely on the people who had so easily discarded me. I found resilience not in spite of their absence, but because of it. I didn't just learn how to get home. I learned how to be at home in myself. It's strange how quickly your definition of family changes when you're forced to stand alone. The people I had always turned to were no longer part of my inner world. I began seeking connection in new places, not in blood ties, but in empathy, shared pain, understanding. I realized that family isn't just who you're born to, it's who shows up when it counts. And on that day, I was the only one who showed up for me. That became my new definition of strength, not relying on others to save me, but trusting myself to survive without them. Self-reliance born from abandonment is not a victory story wrapped in a neat bow. It's gritty, it's painful, it's 1,000 tiny decisions made in fear and exhaustion, but it is also transformative. It teaches you that your strength does not come from who stands beside you, but from who you become when you stand alone. That strength is not loud. It doesn't roar. Sometimes, it's just the quiet determination to keep walking, to keep choosing yourself, even when no one else does. The painful truth about family dynamics and forgiveness is that sometimes love isn't enough. We grow up believing that family means protection, unconditional support, and unwavering presence. We're taught to forgive because they're family, to excuse their behavior because that's just how they are, and to carry wounds in silence for the sake of peace. But when your trust is shattered in a single moment, like being left behind in a strange place, deliberately excluded from the safety of your own people, you begin to question every belief you've ever held about what family really means. The truth hits hard. Love doesn't always equal loyalty, and blood doesn't always mean belonging. What happened to me wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment or a miscommunication that could be smoothed over with a few kind words. It was a conscious choice made by people who claimed to love me. They planned it, they laughed about it, they filmed it, they executed it, and then, when I returned, humiliated and emotionally hollowed out, they acted like I was being unreasonable for not laughing along. That's the dysfunction at the core of so many families. The ability to inflict deep emotional harm and then expect forgiveness without accountability. As though love should erase consequences. As though being related to someone automatically entitles them to your trust again. I realized, in those moments of reflection, that forgiveness within family structures often becomes a weapon. It's not requested with sincerity, it's demanded, used to silence hurt, to reset the cycle, so the same patterns can continue unchecked. There's a pressure to move on quickly, to pretend everything's okay, because the alternative, acknowledging the damage, would force the whole system to reckon with itself. And most families, mine included, are not built to handle truth. They're built to maintain image, to preserve tradition, to avoid discomfort. So when I didn't bounce back the way they expected, I became the problem, not the betrayal, not the abandonment me. My reaction was the issue, not their actions. But I couldn't unsee what had happened. I couldn't unknow the reality that these people, who had shared my childhood, who were supposed to carry my safety like a sacred duty, had instead made a spectacle of my vulnerability. And even more than the act itself, it was their response that drove the knife deeper. No one said, "We're sorry we hurt you." No one acknowledged the fear I felt, the abandonment, the absolute breach of trust. Instead, they dismissed it, minimized it, and expected my silence to confirm my forgiveness. But silence isn't healing, and forgiveness isn't forgetting. There's a complexity to family dynamics that makes this kind of wound linger longer than most. Because you don't just lose the people, you lose the story you had written about them. You lose the idea that they'll always have your back. You lose the home you thought existed, even if it only lived in your mind. And you lose the version of yourself that believed you were truly loved without conditions. That grief is invisible. No one sees it because the people are still alive, still around. You might still show up to gatherings, still smile in photos, but something is irrevocably broken inside. The emotional connection that once felt sacred now feels dangerous, and you learn to guard yourself, even in the middle of people who call themselves your family. Forgiveness, when it does come, is no longer for them, it's for you. It's not an invitation back into the same patterns. It's not about restoring closeness or pretending the past didn't happen. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of carrying their guilt, especially when they refuse to carry it themselves. It's choosing peace, not reunion. It's choosing healing, not forgetting. I had to reach a place where I forgave them not because they asked for it or deserved it, but because I couldn't carry the bitterness any longer. It was poisoning me, not them. The truth is, you can love your family and still walk away. You can wish them well and still protect yourself. You can grieve the loss of what you thought you had while building something new for yourself, something honest, safe, and real. Forgiveness doesn't mean you go back. Sometimes it means you move forward alone, stronger for the journey, wiser for the pain. And in that space, where forgiveness doesn't erase but transforms, you finally begin to breathe again, not as someone's child or sibling, but as your own person, whole and unafraid.